We are honored to be speaking with a professor and chair of the Department of American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University in California. She is also the project director of the Center for Babaylan Studies, Leny Strobel. Welcome to KPFA, Mrs. Strobel.
Thank you.
Could you share with us what Babaylan is and its origin?
Babaylan is a Visayan word, and a Babaylan would be the shaman or healer in the Filipino indigenous cultures. And she has many names in different languages. You know, we have hundreds of indigenous communities in the Philippines, so every community that has its own language will have its own name for the Babaylan or the healer. So she might be called Mumbaki, or Maaram, or Balyan, or Belian, or Dawak, or Catalonan, or, so she goes by very many names, but somehow it's the Visayan term that has become popularized to symbolize or represent this indigenous shamanic healer in the Filipino culture. The Babaylan is one of the 4 pillars of an indigenous community or a barangay, and the other 3 would be the datu and the panday, the craftsperson, and the bayani or bagani, who is the warrior, and then you have the healer or the priestess. And some historians would say that the Babaylan would be the most important figure because the other 3 people will never make decisions without consulting the Babaylan, because she's the one who knows the spirit world. She's the one that can tell when they should be planting their rice, when they should be planting their crops, when they should be harvesting. She would be the one that will bless and do the rituals for abundant harvest and so on. So because she's the one that has access to the spirit world, or considered to be a mediator between this world and the spirit world, then she's trusted to have this wisdom and this knowledge and this power to do those things. But in addition to having the shamanic gifts, she is also a practical healer, like an herbalist, because she knows the plants, she knows the herbs, she knows the roots, and she knows the medicinal value of those things. And sometimes she's not only an herbalist, she is also a healot. She can set your bones right. She is a chiropractor. Mm-hmm. And sometimes she's not only a chiropractor, she's also a therapist. Mm-hmm. So she's this person that embodies all of these gifts. And she's recognized by the community, or confirmed by the community, as someone who has those gifts. So she's a very valued member of the community. That is why when the Spanish came, they were very, very deliberate and thorough in their procedure of extermination, because she was considered, demonic. She was considered heathen, pagan, evil, and basically a threat to this world that they didn't know and they didn't understand. Mm-hmm. Because she would have those powers that they couldn't explain or understand. So,
is Babaylanism a tradition? Would you consider it a tradition, or is it a religion?
It is a living tradition. It is an indigenous tradition. It is not a religion. If you have read Grace Nono's research among Babaylans and primary oralists, in her book, The Shared Voice, she has interviewed Babaylans who have received the power to heal, and the power to chant, and the power to do rituals from the spirit world, and also from the dreams. So because the Philippines has been Christianized, some Babaylans have been Christianized as well. So there is some syncretism that is going on. But in some communities, what we now have, or what we call the schools of living traditions, most of the Babaylan practices, I think, are being looked at now as cultural assets in need of that need to become sustainable and not just preserve but to keep them alive. And so the Kapwa conference that inspired the Babaylan conference here was the Kapwa conference, which is directed and founded by Catherine de Gia and all the other peoples and artists in the Philippines that believe in the value of our indigenous healers, artists, and Babaylans. They know that this is our future. They understand the value of what we have, and of course the sad thing is it's also a very threatened tradition under development and under modernity and under the current political atmosphere back home. We're all under the gun of civil globalization. So those of us that argue for the validity of these living traditions have our work cut out for us.
Yet this tradition that seems so old, why is it forgotten by so many Filipinos?
It's not just Filipinos. It's really a modern phenomenon, and I write about this in the introduction to the Babaylan book. And and one of the things that I said in that video on our website for the Center for Babaylan Studies is that what we are needing to do is to lengthen our historical perspective from 500 years of modernity, lengthen it to maybe 10,000, maybe to hundreds of thousands of years of history and prehistory. And because when you look at what has survived through the holocausts and genocides of this modern era, what you find are indigenous peoples. That's why, how many indigenous peoples are left? Only 3 million around the world, according to the United Nations. Not very many out of 7 billion. But the United Nations has taken an interest in protecting the rights of indigenous peoples around the planet. Mm-hmm. And the Philippines has been very active in being part of that global movement as well. And even in the U.S., you can see that, no? You can see that there is a counterculture, a kind of an undercurrent desire to understand how indigenous cultures have survived, how they have taken care of the environment for thousands of years, how they understand the relationship between the earth and human beings, and so there is a reliance in a way on indigenous knowledge and indigenous expertise that is being sought out today. I did write about that in the introduction to the Babaylan book, on why Filipinos need to get to know our history, but not just what has been written about us by outsiders, but what is present in the oral tradition, because the Babaylan practice is embedded not so much in the knowledge system, but it's embedded in the body, it's embedded in practices that are often unarticulated, And so when somebody eventually comes up with a theory or a concept, and then everybody says, oh, I didn't know that, that's just the way I've always been, The importance, I think, of having had the Babaylan conference and bringing forward the Filipino indigenous knowledge systems and practices is the value of articulating this, because it's just something that we have always practiced and have never named. Because sometimes when you take something for granted, you don't feel the need to name it, you don't feel the need to analyze it or theorize it or philosophize about it. It's just there. So, but because we live in this society that is literate, that privileges the book, that privileges theorizing and education and all that, and so we need to bring that forward and say, we've always known this, you guys, So that I put my trust in that. That is where my work is right now, and I know that this is something that it's not very popular in a way, But since there are people that seem to resonate with it, I think we should continue working on articulating that.
And I wanted to know what made you finally decide to have the conference. What was the push behind it?
Well, we've had a Babaylan Yahoo group for a long time. We had a Babaylan themed conference in New York, put on by the Filipino Women's Network through Perla Daily in 2005. And then I went to St. Scholastica's College in Manila for a Babaylan conference celebrating the centennial of Filipino feminism. And then I attended a Kapwa conference, and we've been having these conversations and ongoing for years now, for more than a decade. And people would always say, well, when are we having a conference? So finally, at the Kapwa conference, we had a Dreamtime group for the non-indigenous participants. And I just blurted, I said, we need to bring this to California because not everybody can come to the Philippines to attend the Kapwa conference. So we'll bring it to California and I will raise enough money. And I said, and then in January of 2009, the core group of people, Leticia Layson and Perla Daly and Bailan Mejino and L'Oreal Crowder and Marianne Ubaldo, we all started talking about really actually doing something about it, creating a nonprofit, and then putting out a vision. What is our vision? What is our goal? Why do we want to do this? And so we went about writing the vision and started sharing it with some folks. And then eventually there was a volunteer crew around the Bay Area in Los Angeles that just picked up the vision and said, we'll do it with you. So for a whole year we had these events that would raise funds so that we could have a conference, so that we could bring resources from the Philippines, because we didn't have foundation money, we didn't have grant monies, we didn't have corporate sponsors, and we knew that it needed to be a grassroots movement anyway, because that is how people get to know what it means to practice this tradition. And so for us it was a practice. It was putting into practice what we thought we knew, what we believe about the Babaylan tradition. And it is very beautiful the way it happened, Let's hope for about 100 people, and almost 300 showed up. And even at the last minute, people were saying, can we come and be your sponsor? Can we do this? Can we, and at the last minute we were saying no. So it was beautiful the way it came out. And there was just so many other things that happened.
I'm curious to hear what you have to say. With the Babaylanism or shamanism, it's not popular, as you say, in this culture and even in our culture. And why is it, do you think, that some people seem afraid or doubt the indigenous way of thinking?
Because we are colonized by the modern narrative. And I don't know how to summarize this history, but in my classes sometimes I ask my students to read the story of Ishmael, written by Daniel Quinn, where he, in novel form, talks about the shift that happened from hunting-gathering societies to agricultural to industrial to the present technological society. And the indigenous, the way he tells about it, he says, at some point when people began to settle in the industrial age and they began to have to produce food and have to work for food, and then once you start hoarding your food, you have to begin to protect it from people wanting to take it. So the beginning of intertribal conflict or people needing to protect property and so on. And then of course that idea became in the modern era became the idea of the private property. and then it developed into the social contract, and then it developed into the idea of capitalism and so on. But what really happened is the divorce of the sacredness of this wholeness, this sacred wholeness that we talk about when we say that indigenous peoples considered the land as sacred. It is not a resource to be exploited. It is not a resource to be owned. But in order to develop capitalism, you have to assume that nature is inanimate, that nature is not sacred, that nature is not imbued with spirit. You have to assume that so you could develop a civilization. Yeah? So what we see around us is a product of that. But some people will call that progress. Some people will call that development. Some people will call that civilization. But when you look at the cost, what is the cost of what we have developed, and who is paying the cost? Look at what is happening in the Gulf with the oil spill. Who is going to pay for that? The cost of that, and the indigenous peoples have always understood that you cannot take away something from nature without giving something back. So all of the rituals of propitiation, of giving an offering back to the gods, of taking only what you need, and all of those indigenous practices is what allowed them to survive, is what allowed these cultures to be sustainable, what allowed them to be here today still, in spite of what we tried to do with them, what civilizations have tried to do with indigenous cultures, eliminating them. So there is a certain wisdom there that is being recognized, I think, and I don't want to go into discussion of religion, but religion has a lot to do with the disappearance of indigenous beliefs and indigenous cultures, because once you develop a theology,
A system.
And a system of belief, then you develop a sacred text that becomes your reference. Among indigenous peoples, they didn't have a sacred text because the earth, the land was their text, was their sacred text. You don't need a tablet or a Bible to say this is what we believe. You just know that. You just know it intuitively, and you know it as something that is always there. You know it as a spirit. You know it as divine. And once you develop the system of theology that abstracts, it abstracts, and then it takes the concept of divine and puts it out there in heaven, and puts it above the earth, and puts it somewhere out there. So everything that is idealized and projected onto this sacred other becomes then separate from your material life, from this material earth. But this is the splitting that a lot of people talk about, the splitting of the modern psyche. And that the split happened among highly civilized cultures first. That's why they were able to develop empires, and then that's why they were able to take colonies. So by the time they came to the Philippines, they were finding remnants of this. They were finding these indigenous groups, and they did the same to us, what has been done to people of the Americas, and people in this continent, and people in Africa, and people in Australia, and so on. So the colonization comes from this very deep source. When people began to develop ideas, about what it means to be human, what it means to be divine, what it means to civilize, and so on. So.
How does a person fulfill the dreams of their elders, and how does one embrace an indigenous knowledge or indigenous spirituality?
I think for us as Filipinos, it begins with decolonization. Actually, my research was first about decolonization, right? How do you undo colonial history, and how you have internalized it, and how it has become a part of you. But then I was getting this question. Well, what do you do after you decolonize?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and if colonization and modernity go hand in hand, how do you critique modernity? And so I began to be drawn to the literature on shamanism, to the literature on hunting and gathering, and on the literature that critiques modernity. And there are many people writing about this, from different disciplines. So I knew that there was already a movement towards that. And so for me, the question then, well, what would be the path for me as a Filipino beyond decolonization? And that is when I started seeing, what is going on in the Philippines. What does the National Commission on Culture and the Arts doing about indigenous cultures? And then I heard about the schools of living tradition. They were putting money into establishing schools of living tradition in different to preserve these indigenous knowledge systems and practices. And then I heard about the work of Catherine and Kidlat Tahimik, and then I heard about the work of Tessa Busan in Bahay Nakpil, and I heard about all these other places in the Philippines that were doing kind of piecemeal, but not really piecemeal because they were all connected to each other. So there's a movement in the Philippines that is there, and then we connect that, and I connected that with what Filipino Americans can do with that information. If we knew. So for me the question was, because this was a question that was asked of me when I was in the Philippines at the Kapwa conference. I said, Leny, if you love the Philippines so much, why aren't you here? Right, no? Mm-hmm. And I said, well, I am an accident of history. I had to leave in order to come home. So when I'm in California, I'm thinking, well, what is my homeland? How do I establish my connection to the land? So for me, it began with the question of where my body is, and how am I rooted to this land, which is the piece of land that I've been in for the last almost 30 years. Mm-hmm. And then I would go to the ocean and just look beyond the horizon, and I would say, the only thing between me and the Philippines is the ocean. Mm-hmm. We're still connected, And I said, if my mind and my body and my spirit is one, and my mind and my spirit is often tied to the Philippines, then I'm in the Philippines when I'm here. Kind of, Doesn't that make sense? So that is kind of how I close the gap in that kind of knowing. Mm-hmm. And I guess that is what I mean when I say, what was the original question? You said,
my question was, how can one embrace an indigenous knowledge or indigenous spirituality?
Yes, so that's where I was leading to this idea of embodiment. How do you embody an indigenous mindset or indigenous way of life? And I don't know that I can be considered indigenous. Kidlat would say I am Indiogenous. Did you read about that term in the book? Anyway, the concept of Indiogenous is applied to those who are not really land-based, to those who are not tribal, because in the Philippines there's still a difference between being indigenous and land-based, and those who are non-indigenous and somehow in the diaspora or are not living in their ancestral domains. Mm-hmm. That's the difference. So I guess there was an indigenous person who told Kidlat Tahimik, he says, I guess you can be Indiogenous, meaning to say you've been colonized already, but you're just trying to get back to your indigenous roots. So he coined the phrase Indiogenous. Anyway, that's just a play on words, but it's also it can be a concept. I always in this work want to emphasize the difference between that and recognize the fact that there is primary Babaylan work. that there are babaylans in the Philippines that are land-based, that are living in their ancestral domains, that are serving their communities as they've always had for centuries and thousands of years. There are those. And those primary babaylans today are, sometimes Carl Gaspar would call them an endangered species because, of course, they have the resources in those domains and the government is trying to take over those resources and so on. So there's a lot of problem there. The other thing that I differentiate is there is the primary babaylan, but then there is the contemporary appropriation of the babaylan practice by Filipinos that are not indigenous. So you could be in the Philippines or you could be in the diaspora, but you could be one of those persons that is trying to decolonize, that is trying to honor indigenous ways or indigenous knowledge, that is trying to be in solidarity with the struggle of indigenous peoples. And so I think those of us that were at this conference recognize that as the connection and the practice that we do, no? Whether it is through the healing work, whether it's through the arts, whether it's through activism, whether it's through scholarly work, that you are consciously doing the work and living your life in order to be in solidarity with those indigenous communities that we are tied to, but also to the indigenous struggles in this land.
Right.
Yeah. So eventually, in the future, the Center for Babaylan Studies is thinking about that, of creating those bridges to other native cultures. But native communities, when they think about Filipinos, they also don't see us as being indigenous, so we still need to create those bridges.
What is the importance of practicing this tradition in today's globalization?
In a way, we are recreating the practices and the rituals because not everybody has access to primary sources. When, for example, I tried to have access to primary babaylans in the Philippines, I was told that if I only had 2 weeks, don't bother, because trying to establish contact, trying to settle in the community, trying to know the community so that they can welcome you, and that doesn't happen in 2 weeks. That doesn't happen in a short research period. So I understand that. I myself do not have access to primary sources, even though I have met some primary babaylans. In our conversations with people like Katrin Dekia and Chris Nono and some of the culture bearers in the Philippines that do have contact with primary babaylans, we have permission. For example, by Lisa from the Talaandig tribe in Mindanao was in California last year, and she taught us the Dugso dance, and she showed us how to do the Talaandig altar, and then she gave us permission to use it. So that is what we had at the conference, was we had a Talaandig altar to the ancestors, and we had the permission to do that. But as far as the other rituals, like if you've been to any of our babaylan events, there will be spoken word, Joe de Olympia writing about decolonization, and or Mila Koger, writing a poem about her grandmother and the power of her grandmother. So a lot of us are creating practices of our own and rituals of our own in order to invite the babaylan spirit to inspire us. And that is one thing that we always say, is that we are not babaylans. We are babaylan inspired.
Oh, okay.
You can be a babaylan inspired artist or activist or teacher or healer or priestess, but because we respect the primary babaylans in the Philippines that have been, when you become a babaylan, it's not something that you take upon yourself. It is something that the community recognizes and affirms and confirms.
Oh, I see.
But see, because we are in the diaspora, and we don't, and the context is very different. It will be kind of arrogant of us to assume that we can call ourselves Babaylan because we do not have the community, we do not have the context, we do not have the ancestral domain that will say, oh yeah, we've known that he comes from a line of helots, or comes from a line descended from so and so, and so there's a genealogy, there's a history that we here in the contemporary context of using Babaylan practice do not have. So we recognize that. We also recognize, though, that we have permission because we also have access to the spirit world, no? We have access to our ancestors. Some of us have dreams, some of us have received visions. So we have some of that, but maybe in the future, you never know, you know. But so we say, you can say that you can be Babaylan inspired, but to say that I am a Babaylan is just, I think, very kind of arrogant.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. Because it does make sense to me. I've always felt like one should not just say that it is the community that recognize you.
It is never self-ascribed.
Yeah. Thank you. I know I've gained a lot of insights from what you've said, but is there any words of wisdom or insights you would like to share to the Filipino community or to our global listeners?
I think it'll be good to familiarize ourselves with the process of decolonization, because I think decolonization can be a spiritual path. It can lead you to understand what it means to be Filipino, what it means to be indigenous, and the importance of having a historical perspective. Because I think what happens in people that are searching for spirituality or a spiritual practice is the tendency is to bypass all of these things, you know, politics, history, economics, social issues, classes, race, gender, is to bypass all of these things, and they just say, I'm going to become spiritual. Well, if you're going to become spiritual and if you're going to become whole, it includes your identity as a historical being. And for us, that means you have to know why you became Filipino. Why are we Filipinos? Why aren't we Maharlikans? You know? Or why am I not Manobo? Why am I not Igorot? Why am I not, you know? So you have to understand history and how that happened. So when you understand the process of colonization, then you can begin the process of decolonization, and then you begin to understand all of those things about yourself that you have repressed or forgotten or negated. You know, that's why so many people at this conference said, "Oh, my grandmother was a helot. My grandmother knew this. My grandma." So it's everybody has a memory, genetic memory, cultural memory of having had someone in their family that had these gifts. You know, gifts of healing and gifts of vision and priestessing and ritual and so on. But because modernity and colonization has told us, no, that's, you know, can't do those things. So we became Catholics, we became Protestants, we became all these other religious identities that we have taken on. There is some people can syncretize those things very well, like Sister Mary Jan Manansan in the book, where she says, I'm a Catholic nun, I am a Zen, I practice Zen, I'm also, you know, a Babaylan. That's what she would say, you know. But for her to arrive at that integration of identities, when you look at her life work, when you look at what she did with her life, you know, then you can say, yeah, that can happen. You know, but that's a lifetime work. Yeah. So, but just to begin where you are, you know, to begin to understand, you know, why are there how many millions of people working as OFWs in other places, taking care of other people's children and leaving our children behind? What is that phenomenon about? What is this globalization? What has it done to us and our families? You know, what has it done to our sense of wholeness? So those are all kind of connected.
Yeah.
It's not enough to say, oh yeah, I made it in America and I made a lot of money and bought a lot of houses and cars and sent my kids to college. You know, it's not enough. It's not enough. And even if you have been successful, what have you done with that success? What have you given back? So indigenization or the indigenous belief is always about giving back. You know, what do you give back to the land? What do you give back to your community? What do you give back?
And the important is remembering.
Yeah.
And I think that's what the Babaylan conference was. For me, it was remembering that there are these ancient knowledge and the elders coming out to help us out, you know, as younger generation to guide us, which was for me was really important. And would you like to give us a contact or website for people who wants to know more?
www.babaylan.net. We will be archiving the videotapes from the conference, so people that didn't attend can have access to those sessions. They can call us at 707-494-4967 and email us at contact@babaylan.net.
And I want to thank you, Mrs. Leny Strobel, for your work. Good luck to you in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you. This is Ilaya of Radyo Kalayaan here on KPFA. Thank you for listening.
Yeah.